It's particularly special for me to be here because I was a student here 30 years ago, which is hard to believe for me, at least. And it was a very important moment because I had actually accepted an architecture school and had even put down a deposit. And then the school and Graham gave me another year scholarship. And I lost my deposit and I didn't go to architecture school, and I've never looked back. Not to say it hasn't been very difficult, but I'm very glad for that. And so it's very special to have the show here and to give a talk tonight. In an attempt to sort of restructure my talk over the last few years, I've switched from chronological to thematic. And so there are going to be five themes: doodling, as you can see. Oops, I'll go back to it. Systems, precarious systems, musicality, experientiality, and movement, and lastly, photography. And I wanted to start with this image, which is, it's my file of facts, and I probably bought it in the early 90s, and I used it up until 2004. And the reason I'm starting with this is because I feel like it was when I realized that doodling and my file of facts was much more interesting to me than what I was doing in the studio. And I sort of wondered what that was about. So I'd say that one thing was that it was simultaneously a process and an image, that it also was something that's kind of intimate and private. Also, it's something that happens on the margins, or things that, it's something that happens when your mind is absent. But of course, something is very present when you're doing this. But there's something mysterious about it and its logic. So I decided to make a radical move and stop painting entirely. And I abandoned oil paint and panels and canvas. And I was also working with spray paint at the time, a real lovely toxic mix of oil paint and spray paint. And I was at Hunter, and this is my studio at Hunter. It was a 700 square foot space. This was when it was on 41st Street, and it had a running length of 45 feet with a wall height of 11 feet. And so I decided to draw on it. And sort of trying to inhabit the doodling mentality. But what I also learned from this is that I was very much influenced by the infrastructure and the architecture of the space itself. It was quite eccentric. It had an enormous dysfunctional boiler in it. And you can see some of these pipes up here. And this is another part of that wall. And I also realized that another thing about this kind of doodling, which is very organic and kind of unpremeditated, is that it can imply that sort of a sense of infinity, or a sense that it would just go on forever. I also recognized that I like to colonize space, and that I was sort of struck by that. And so, but at the same time, there was part of it that I felt had failed the doodling. And so I painted all over it. I mean, not painted all over it. I painted it, and with much difficulty. And I made this piece, which is called Number One Doodle. And it's a very bad slide. And here you can see it. It's an 8-foot square canvas. And the central part is a doodle made of Sharpie marker. And what I realized from this piece was that I had gone up in size and also scale. And what I wanted to do was retain the scale, to go up in size, but retain the scale and the intimacy and the humor of doodling. And I also wanted it to exist within the context of painting, so it's on a canvas. And I was very interested in drawing and doodling and seeing how it could exist sort of in the context of large abstract painting. And this will look familiar to most or some of you. This is downstairs in the gallery. This is called The Black One, and it's from 1997. And it was actually my first show at Postmasters in 1998. And I feel like this and a series of pieces I made was really an outgrowth and a further expansion of this kind of drawing. And I was very interested also in kind of creating a tension between what you could see and what you couldn't, what might be sort of almost obliterated. So it was a play a little bit between clarity and obfuscation. And another thing that happened with the Sharpie marker was when I first started using it, it sort of seemed like the antithesis of freedom, and quite unfree, in fact, because a permanent marker on a piece of blank canvas does not feel particularly relaxing. And so it wasn't until I started to discover that, in fact, the mistakes and the cross-outs and the annotations and all of these things became part of the piece and part of its content. And then things really sort of shifted for me. Another thing in this piece and others you'll see is that there are three-dimensional structures that you can see here that are pipe cleaners and silver tape. There's pom-poms, there's felt. And I was kind of, at the same time, I was sort of doing these sort of three-dimensional doodles in a way on my wall that were kind of sculptural. And I had no experience working with 3 dimensions, which was actually kind of liberating, I think, because I didn't have any rules or any expectations. A little like leaving painting and going into working with Sharpie markers, sort of the burden of history is kind of lifted. And I've started making instruction manuals in, I guess it was probably 1998, and it was really for practical reasons, either for someone wanting to buy it or for it being installed and deinstalled elsewhere. And I'm showing the black one because I thought that would be perhaps interesting, given that it's downstairs and perhaps some of you are here in the audience who installed it. And so here's a sample page, and most of the instruction manuals have a certain format, and with each one that I made, they became more kind of detailed because it was a kind of trial and error experience. I can proudly say that this piece, for instance, has been installed in Europe and all over, in this country as well, and on the West Coast with no problems. So it does have a practical function, even though it looks maybe a little kind of, I don't know, chaotic or like some sort of imaginary system that doesn't really amount to something. And this is the wall in my studio at Hunter, just to give you a little sampling. So we've got felt, pom-poms, Scotch tape, acetate, security envelopes, aluminum tape that you get in the hardware store, frame. And so these were the things that started to migrate onto the canvases. And this is a multicolor one from 1998. And as much as I was engaged in the three-dimensional and the sort of bringing those two together, I was also still very much interested in drawing and painting, and I didn't want to abandon that, and I didn't see it as a sort of linear path of like, oh, now I do this and I don't do that anymore. And this is a piece from '99 called "The Best Part of the Song," and it's too short. And this is a detail of that piece. And then this is a piece called Overdrive, and it's also, from my point of view, very much informed by a certain doodle mentality that was increasingly becoming, I felt, both organic and also quite mechanical. And it was important for me that those two things coexisted, because they, for me, are 2 points of fascination, and I'm interested in how sometimes they're treated as if they're unrelated. And the strange story about this drawing, which is that I actually made it for photograph for a sculpture. But like often, what happens with me is that it sort of took on a life of its own. And that's another thing that about doodling and also about art, or at least my making of art, is that I love the fact that I don't know what's going to happen when I start. And I love the journey. Even though at times I want to shoot myself, I do really, I think that's one of the things I like most about making art. And so this, here's the sculpture called All Our Wandering from 2007. It's about 12 feet long with 5 different boxes. And it's made, this is the interior, so if you were confronting the piece, it's about 7 feet high, and this is what you would see. And it's made from all the red artworks that I've ever made, brought into a computer, brought into Photoshop, where then I created 24 unique panels. And then after they were laminated, I then went in for 2 weeks and drew on them. And I wanted to kind of create this confusion or this conflation between what was digitally produced and what was then made by hand. And so here you can see, but what happened was I didn't have enough red pieces to make 24 unique panels, so that was how Overdrive started, but then Overdrive became very much a piece in its own right. And then this is a piece that I also put in the context of doodling. In a way, I only thought of this morning when I was looking at this piece, is that it harks back to my studio at Hunter, I think, in that I see it as an enormous drawing or enormous doodle. And this is a recent commission that's at the Virginia, at the Moss Center for the Arts at Virginia Tech University. And it's 17 feet high, and it's 121 feet long and goes over 8 walls. And here you get another section of it. And I felt like it was this sort of enormous doodle. In fact, this whole section here is made by hand, where I worked there and worked with paint markers and paint, and then other areas are clearly computer generated. For instance, there's a large part of Illustrator in there, and then manipulation of my my artworks through Photoshop, and then other areas within the piece, like like over here, and also over there, where I'm improvising to some extent, and I'm also, and over in there as well, am also going by some designs that I had made. I would say that this piece is really different for me, because when you work on a scale like this, you can't leave things for chance. And so I don't think I've ever, except for All Our Wandering, the big box piece, I don't know if it's rare that I have planned a drawing like this, but it was necessary because it also, every single part has to kind of fit together, and every measurement is vital. And I've found that, I thought being an artist meant that I wouldn't have to ever do math, because I'm not good at math, but I'm fascinated by it, as I am with science and structures and systems. But God, do I use math a lot. And if you and if you do anything like this, I can assure you, you too will be relying on math, and it's unavoidable, I've realized. And then I was showing this image of me, not to show a picture of me, but I feel like because the piece is a hybrid of handmade and digitally produced imagery, it's hard in a photograph to tell that it actually is handmade. And so this is one of the few photographs I have where you can actually, I think, really see that this has all been made with drawing and by hand. And then I love this image just because it's the smallest studio I've ever had. And and it was a scissor lift, and I was so happy. So, if you're a new young person and looking for a studio, you might end up with something as small as this. Hopefully not. And now I want to switch gears to systems, and I would say that I think for a very long time I've been fascinated with systems and structures, and I think that one thing that I started to realize was that that drawing in a way was a system, or that within my doodling, as much as it was spontaneous and organic, it sort of looked like I was building some imaginary city, and it wasn't conscious. And so it became, increasingly interested in why are the things that we doodle, or I doodle, resemble things that are structural or could resemble something that exists in the world, but I'm not working from observation. It's very much working from my imagination. And this is a piece called Speedway, where I sort of wanted to make a dysfunctional speedway. I think an octagon is very hard to navigate. And but I also was interested in setting up some rules. Often I'll do that. I'll set up some very, very basic rules that more often than not I break. And this piece I wanted to juxtapose, in my mind, two kinds of drawing. One being very sort of measured and geometric and predictable, and the other being more doodle-like in this way. And so I felt like what I set out to do was that any time I was working two-dimensionally, it would be this kind of more geometric drawing, and any time that I created one of these voids, these sort of rooms, it would be more doodle-like, which at the time I was associating with more of a psychological space, or a dream-like space, or somewhere you might get lost in. And over here, you can't see it, but there are many different rooms, and some of them are quite labyrinth-like. So you'd have to almost stick your head in to be able to see where it goes. And then, as often happens when you make an interior space, you end up with an exterior space. And so I had been working with this principle, and then I looked at the back, and of course it did not look like this. It was white, and it was made of foam core, but I couldn't resist working on it and turning it into a piece that then obviously resembles sort of an architectural structure, maybe, if Mondrian was an architect or a dollhouse maker. And I was interested in that sort of system of, it's a very common, it's a feature of architecture where you have a facade and then you have an interior. And so in a way, that's how this piece functions. And for me, something I liked about it was that it's not clear which is the front and which is the back. And then you may have recognized that these two here are directly inspired this piece of many years later, all are wondering. And then you might be wondering why I'm showing a picture of NASDAQ, NASCAR. Needless to say, it's not something I knew a lot about, but I had cut it out of the New York Times because I was cutting out a lot of photography, a lot of photographs from the New York Times, and I was feeling like some of the best photography being done was in the New York Times. And I was struck by the color and the color coding, and I realized that was something that I was kind of already doing in a way when I left oil paint behind and I substituted it with Sharpie markers. I really kind of almost started to approach color as a kind of color coding, because the piece, blue is blue in a Sharpie. There's no other, well, now they have turquoise or something, but it's very, 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 very direct and very unart in a way, very unnuanced. And I was interested I had become increasingly interested in how color coding was all around us, and yet we didn't really pay attention to it. And I'm very interested in how information and how communication is visualized, and how often the color in our world that we make exists in these strange places. Like, this to me seems very kind of theatrical, and it's like some sort of theater, and everyone's got their different outfits, they're all their colors, the cars, but it seems like such an unlikely environment to be so aestheticized. And many years later, this is a photograph I took in Daytona. I was the artist in resident at the Atlantic Center for the Arts in New Smyrna, which is right next door to Daytona. So I was able to go, and I was completely unprepared for this. It's 120,000 seated, I don't know what you call it, like a, not an auditorium, no, a stadium, right? I was fascinated again with this sort of use of color and this sort of aestheticization and this kind of burst of playfulness and joy and pattern. And this is another photograph I took there, and that's of a section that was just black and white. And I liked, for me too, this photograph for me also kind of, I think it sort of becomes disorienting because it also to me almost looks like keyboards on a computer or on a typewriter. And so this sense of what scale this is becomes difficult to determine. And this is a piece called Audience that actually grew out of many, many many photographs I'd taken in different places, in China, in Florida, in New York, in upstate New York, various places where I was seeing this kind of use of pattern and color in just ordinary life. Oops. Oh, I guess I'm going backwards. Okay, sorry. And then this is also a system that is both, for me, addressed. This is Orange Alert UK, and this is the very beginning of it in a studio at the Wimbledon School of Art when I had a fellowship at the Drawing Room in London. And I went there just a few weeks after we'd invaded Iraq, and that's why the name of the piece is Orange Alert UK. And I was just describing the situation in the States, and particularly New York, where where we'd been orange alert since 2001, and I had experienced that and seen some of that happen before my eyes, as I'm sure a lot of you did as well. And I was surprised that they had no idea what I was talking about. And so that was, sort of given the fact that I was already very attuned to color and, subway maps and mapping and traffic lights and all these different ways in which color manifests itself in ordinary ways, I was struck by how this was a color code system with no color. It was almost like it was trying to color code fear. And it seemed like kind of an absurd, bizarre thing to do. And so I am not at all claiming that this piece has anything to do with the political situation of, of the time, because often what happens is something becomes a catalyst. And so this sort of interest and the strangeness of it kind of inspired me to make a piece called Orange Alert UK, which had its beginnings in 2003, and it traveled, all in many, many different European cities, and then it came to New York I was at my show at MoCA Cleveland in 2007, and then its final destination was, appropriately so, New York. And this is at Postmasters in 2008. And so you can see that I'm, using very much the kind of the color coding of that system, but in a kind of completely sort of my own way, and so there's no real, it's kind of like a system that is sort of an imaginary system. And this is a view of it as you leave. So it was a room, this piece. And then this is also a piece that I think of in terms of systems, also color coding, but also plumbing. I am very interested in both plumbing and electrical systems, and I often, when I photograph, those are the things I'm drawn to. And I think it's partly that I am drawn to the things that are in plain sight that we might not see. And I was in a big industrial building in Long Island City and was taking photographs of what I felt like was just kind of an extraordinary situation. And it looked to me almost like an installation itself. And I had already started working with red tubes and had been working on a piece called Constellation Vanity. And then this influenced me when I was in a show, the Hurricane Sandy show at Industry City. And so that's what you're looking at now, which had a similar plumbing system. And the coding for red is that whenever you see red, it means that there is water coming through and it's attached to sprinklers. So it's sort of in a way, a kind of a red alert. I was in the show, sadly, because I lost an enormous amount of work from Hurricane Sandy. So this show was also very meaningful for me. And here you can see the interaction with the actual pipes. And here there were areas where I cut holes through this wall so that you could see the city outside. And I think part of that impulse is that I'm very interested in connecting art and abstract art and contemporary art with the world and with people who might not even consider themselves interested in contemporary art. And I think that harks back to one of the initial appeals of doodling, which was that it's, in a way, everybody doodles, regardless of whether you think you can draw. Most people say, oh, I can't draw, but I bet they're doodling. And I'm interested, it sort of democratizes it, and it also shows that there's some kind of very, very strong impulse in us to visualize things and to make things visual, and that we all share that. And this is a front-on picture of the piece. The piece on the ends of the dowels had mirrors, so that's what you're looking at. And so it's sort of kind of, when you looked at it straight on, it kind of fractured your vision. And you can kind of see, I took this picture, and you can see a part of my face in there. And I like the idea that you could never actually see something in its entirety, and that sort of as kind of the opposite of a selfie or looking at yourself in the mirror, or the certain kind of narcissism that we're all very much involved in today, I think at very heightened levels due to technology and also due to human nature. This kind of fractured that. And then now we're going to move to precarious systems, which probably could characterize a lot of my work. I think that part of the appeal to me of systems is that you can break them, or they can break. And I think that I'm fascinated by the fact that we put so much trust in systems, but that we I will say a little bit more about that, but that I think that we live with these systems, and our bodies are systems, and that we don't think so much about systems failing. And I think that I feel that for myself personally, that I maybe I have a distrust of systems, or I want to kind of disorient them or destabilize them. Now, this is a piece called Mechanical Cloud that I made when I was at the American Academy in Rome, and it's probably about 6 feet wide, made of corrugated plastic, Velcro, felt, and map pins, and it may even have a couple of photographs in it. And it doesn't look very unstable, but my idea for it in '04 was, I don't know where it came from, but because the iCloud or cloud, whatever, hadn't, I certainly wasn't aware of it, but I was imagining like what would happen if a cloud could no longer exist and what it would look like. So it's a sort of like a cloud that's on life support. And I don't know if it was that because the American Academy was so beautiful that I had a heightened appreciation for the beauty of the natural world, whereas at the time I had been living in south side of Williamsburg, where literally people would tear trees out of the pavement so that they could get to the loading dock. So this was a very different world. And here's a detail from that piece. And then another piece, Hidden Track, Sabotage the Random, which I also consider a precarious system, and also an attempt, as often I do, is sort of trying to conflate or combine systems. And as I've mentioned already, that often I feel like we treat like the human body as one thing and then the things that we make as something else. And I feel so much so that I feel very strongly that in fact so much of what we make is unconsciously what we are, and that some of our impulses or most of our impulses are probably connected in this unconscious way. So, like for instance, I wanted to make a piece. It's made almost entirely of vinyl, and right here, this is about 7 feet high, and it's made of hundreds of cubes that I made and cut out of acetate and made the linear structures. And I was thinking of it as kind of a circulatory system, and it's sort of echoing infrastructure or plumbing systems or electrical systems. And I wanted it to be life-size because I wanted you to have a kind of visceral reaction. So when you're up in front of it, it fills your entire vision. And I was interested in kind of, or I think a lot about how we conceal the structures that enable us to live every day. Probably less so here in this older building where we see pipes everywhere and interesting sort of structures and systems, but by and large, the computer, the iMac would be, a perfect example where you want to conceal the mechanisms, and the car, you want to conceal it. And I think that it's so connected to the way we are built, right? All the messiness, all the incredible intricacies inside of our bodies is covered. So we don't experience it, and we do that to the world. And so that was one of the things I was thinking about, is that, obviously the body is a vulnerable system and a precarious system, but we can't think that way every day or we wouldn't be able to get up in the morning. And then this is a piece called Missed Once that I feel is more also precarious. This is the side of it, and I felt like it was almost in a somewhat unknowingly at the time, somewhat autobiographical, and was sort of a kind of a manifestation of my ambiguity when it came to these different disciplines and different systems. Is this a drawing? Is this a painting? Is this an installation? Is this a sculpture? And for me, this piece is sort of like maybe an installation or a sculptural piece that's still umbilically connected to the wall. And I think that speaks to my relationship and my continued interest in painting and in frontality and the tension between these different visual languages. I also, when I was making this piece, I had this image of instability in the form of a little child, in how I think we've all seen that, where there's like a child who hasn't yet learned to walk, and you're looking at him and you don't know if he's going to go this way, if he's going to go this way, or if he's going to finally balance. So that was an image I had going through my head. And this is the back of the piece, which is also sort of becomes kind of a parody of sort of electrical circuitry gone haywire, and also a bit of a parody of myself, because the back of the piece is made up of discarded manuals and then imaginary manuals, and so it's completely fantastical and it makes no sense. And I think I also sort of had this fantasy that I didn't have to make manuals anymore, that I could somehow have them in the piece so that the pieces could install themselves. And then this section is, or this theme is experiential, musical, and movement. It's kind of a mouthful. And I'm going to start with a piece called Swarm that I also made when I was at the American Academy in Rome. I was in a studio that had been designed for people making equestrian statuary. So it was probably the largest studio I've ever had, it will ever have, so it was a bit daunting and at first. But that's where this piece grew. And I want to just start with an anecdote. When I showed this piece, the first time I showed it after Rome was at Postmasters, and a young woman came who had been a student of my mom and who had also was a dancer and quite serious and had studied ballet and was now, I think she was working with a company. And she knew that I had danced in my high school quite seriously, and that and then I said to her that my fantasy was to be a choreographer, and for physical reasons I had to stop dancing. And maybe that's a good thing, because I can imagine that I know that poetry, being a poet is harder than being an artist, and maybe being a modern choreographer is equally as hard, or more difficult than being an artist. But I said, yeah, I'll always miss it, but I had always wanted to choreograph. And she said, well, you're choreographing. This is choreography. This is spatial. And she went on like that. And it was so surprising to me, because as soon as she said it, I thought it made perfect sense, but it never had occurred to me that my interest in sort of experiential space and sort of trying to coax the viewer to kind of interact with it in this way was connected to dance and to choreography. The piece also, so for me, I just tell that anecdote that happened way after the piece, so it didn't influence the making of it. But when I was in Rome, I saw the amazing swarms of birds that would come into the sky in September, and like nothing I'd seen. And I also was very attentive, as I always am, to signage, and there were these huge like black arrows on the big highways. And when you drove, as you always would see them when you're driving, they almost felt like some sort of strange drawing or animation. And so that was also part of the source. And I show this here just to give you a sense of the scale and also the process, because these installations are extremely laborious, and on top of the fact that the making of the work is incredibly labor-intensive as well. But it's something that I enjoy, because I then interact with a lot of people. This is at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland. And here's another shot of it. And I feel that what happens in this piece for me is that the arrows almost feel trembling, or and that's partly the nature of their form, but also that there are these wonderful shadows that happen. So it's almost like there's a second piece, or there's a drawing that's there as well. And I like this sort of sense of trembling and of movement and of motion. And here, this was at MoCA Cleveland, the motion is stopped because they collide with a column, so they don't go any further than that. And then this is also a piece I put within this theme. This is a public art piece in Staten Island that was commissioned by Percent for Art, and it was the first public piece I had done, and I frankly didn't know why they'd asked me, because I was working with pom-poms and pipe cleaners and paper. So unlike some people who have to tone down their content, I had to figure out how I could make something that would withstand, this enormous high school and all these children. And I learned a term which is called attractive nuisance. which is actually a legal term, but it's also used in architecture. And I realized that that could kind of define a lot of the art I had made in my life. And I was told, whatever you do, you don't want to make an attractive nuisance. And so for me, the challenge of this piece was that it was a boomerang wall, and so you could never see it. And what you're seeing here, I should say, is me putting two photographs together. It's being taken outside and photographed at night, because that's the only way you can see the piece in its entirety. And so for me, it became very much about that limitation and about moving through a space. And so things were episodic, and things, it wasn't meant to be the situation where you take in the whole. It's more like you're experiencing it, this moment or that moment. So that was something that I thought of, and I felt, and this is a glass, these are glass windows into a library behind it, and then here's the end. So you're sort of kind of traveling. If you were there, this is sort of how it would go. And I felt like there was, for me, a kind of a musicality and a kind of a sense that this could kind of go on forever and sort of move, and you could move with it. And this is the detail of the windows, and then just for fun, I'll show you what's behind the windows, which was the computer library. And I like the sort of aquarium-like feeling of it. I quickly abandoned the idea that I was making a piece on an island, so I kind of like this, because when you're on Staten Island, you have no real, after you get off the boat, and I wasn't taking the boat, I had to take a car to get to where this school is located. I never had a sense that I was on an island, so to me this sort of echoes the fact that it is. And then this is a detail of two of the parts on it. And it was a wonderful experience doing this piece, because I worked with some amazing people, and I was actually allowed to work on site. So things were fabricated, but then I was making decisions on, right there. So this is something that I did spontaneously on site at the school. And then I'm going to end, let me look at my time here. Okay, oops, I forgot to set my timer. Okay, I keep doing that. I wanted to end with photography, which until recently has been kind of difficult for me to talk about, because I find that the work that's closest to me is the most difficult to talk about. And one of the reasons I can talk about some of the other work is not because I could talk about it at the time. In fact, my first talk was at Hunter in 1998, and I thought, what am I going to say? So I'm someone who sort of really works visually and is thinking as I'm going, but I don't have a kind of some sort of premeditated idea, which I think is probably apparent in what you've seen. And so I'm showing here an image of my studio wall, where I just was putting up photographs from the New York Times, photographs of artworks I liked, and also, though, photographs of mine. And I got a digital camera in 2003, and I think that was, I didn't realize it would be kind of a life-changing event, but I think if there hadn't been a digital camera, I probably would not have pursued photography in the way that I have, because I like, just like doodling or like working with foam core, I like to be able to work on it myself and not be sending it to a lab, or, I want to be involved. So all my photographs I print myself, and I work with, and I want that kind of immediacy. So what I decided to do, a little like what I did when I abandoned painting, was I made this rule that I would make work, I would start working but only use my own photography and not ask any questions as to what I was doing, because I'm not a photographer and I didn't want that burden of the photography. And so I just kept sort of silencing that inner critic, which, as I think we all know, can be so harsh at times. And here's, and then it sort of I started making pieces and printing so many pieces that I ran out of room, and so it sort of spilled onto this wall. And then this wall, or these walls, became almost like a feeder wall for larger pieces. Here I just want to show, this is obviously something that has grown out of these walls that's downstairs. But what happened, right, so from here is that then certain things would almost like assert themselves in a sense that they wanted to graduate or they wanted to become large. You know, not that things weren't autonomous, but that there was this other thing. And so a piece like Undercover is an example. And it's about 11 feet long, and it's made, its sort of starting point is photography. And so here you can see the photographs, and here is a photograph that I took. It's just in a dumpster with a light hitting some garbage bags and Staples next to my studio. And like often happens, it was a discovery for me. So this section is entirely made from those photographs. But what happened was that it was actually initially because I didn't know how to print. And so I was printing and never getting what seemed like was on the screen. And then at a certain point, I realized that that wasn't important, and that in a way this was like a drawing or like a value study. And then the rest of the piece sort of grew from that. And here is another photograph that features prominently in the piece. I'm obsessed with airports and with Florida. And particularly, there's something about airports in Florida that I just can't resist photographing. And this is another piece that also, this is called Turf, and this is also working from photographs, and also, obviously, it's quite installational and sculptural. Oops. Okay, little mistake. And this is one of the photographs that inspired or got me started with turf. And it's a photograph I took in a remote part of Washington State. It was this moss that was just taking over these planks of wood. And it was both gorgeous, and it also just showed to me the just incredible resilience of nature. And then this is a piece that, this is a piece I do know the name. It's Silver City. And this is a piece that's downstairs, and it's composed of just two photographs. And one is a kind of a photograph I took of the sky that felt particularly kind of foreboding. And then the other photograph is, some of you may recognize, this is a photograph from the High Line. And what you're looking at is Chelsea Piers and that enormous structure where people, I guess, play golf or baseball, and this catches the balls. And what I started realizing with my photography is that because I'd made art for so long, that when I was looking out in the world, I was actually looking for drawings and finding drawings in the world. And to me, this is like a drawing, but it also echoes drawings that I've made. And I think it was then that I realized that the photography wasn't this sort of alien creature, that it could be completely integrated, just like a doodle could be completely integrated into a painting. And I very much wanted that. I wanted also, you know, and here's Highline, which is also downstairs, that also takes from those photographs, as well as some shots I took of, you know, the video screens in an airplane. And I think that once I realized that, it just became so natural to me to work with it, because it just became like another ingredient. It didn't have the weight of a photograph. And I very much also didn't want to do this thing where, you know, take a square photograph and stick it on a canvas or something. I wanted, because there's no reason a photograph has to be a square or a rectangle, and I wanted to really bring it into the life of the artwork, because I think photography is, as we know, is everywhere, and it's not this sort of thing to quote, or it's not something to appropriate. For me, it's part of my language at this point. And here is a piece that might look like it has nothing to do with photography, and this is my last piece that I'll show, I think. And it's a piece that's actually going to be installed in the next year and a half, I hope. It's on Roosevelt Island, and it was a commission from the MTA, and it's outdoors. And this is a Photoshop of it. And it's quite an amazing setup because I was able to respond to this ventilating structure, and maybe unlike a lot of people who perceive it as an eyesore, I actually thought it was beautiful. And so I worked with it, and I sort of, here you can see I also worked with photographs I've taken of the water, and this is the mosaic version of it where you have glass mosaic. There's just a basic tile, very ordinary tile, granite. And I was heavily involved in the process. I'm not a mosaic artist, but I was very much like a helicopter artist in this way. And then these were just a sampling of many photographs that I took that became sources of inspiration. So again, like the photograph or the way that I frame the world through the camera is, to me, very much integral to the way that I think and what I make. And I'll just show a couple of more. This is the mosaic, and I'll just end with this picture to give you a sense of the scale. The piece is in storage, ready to be installed, and I am very eager for that to happen. And this is a photograph that I took in a mosaic fabricator outside of Venice where it was made. So that's it. I hope I haven't talked too long. I end. But thank you so much.